It was another Saturday morning, and as usual, I was getting ready to take Matilda out for our father-daughter day. She had her heart set on a new book and, of course, some ice cream from her favorite shop. Alice had already left for her shift at the hospital, so it was just Matilda and me. These days were the highlight of my week, giving me a break from my long hours at the construction site and a chance to bond with my girl. We spent the day shopping, eating ice cream, and feeding the birds at the park. Matilda's laughter filled the air, making me forget all my worries. When we got home, I noticed Alice wasn't back yet. Usually she would be home by now, but maybe her shift had run late. I shrugged it off and decided to start preparing dinner. It was around 9 p.m. when Alice finally walked through the door. She seemed different, almost glowing. She kissed me on the cheek and went straight to Matilda, hugging her tightly. I asked her about her day, and she told me it had been busy at the hospital. But something felt off. She was more cheerful than usual, more alive. As the days went by, I noticed small changes in Alice. She started paying more attention to her appearance, wearing makeup and dressing up even on her days off. She also seemed to be spending more time at work, taking extra shifts. I figured she was just trying to help out more financially, especially since Matilda's needs were growing as she got older. One evening, Alice suggested we go out for dinner. Just the two of us. It had been a while since we had a proper date night, so I eagerly agreed. We found a cozy little Italian place in downtown Orlando and spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. For a moment it felt like we were newlyweds again. But as the weeks turned into months, those moments of connection became rare. Alice was often tired, and our conversations became more about logistics and less about each other. I missed the closeness we used to have, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap. One Saturday while Alice was at work, Matilda and I decided to surprise her by cleaning the house and cooking her favorite meal. We spent the whole day scrubbing, dusting, and preparing a delicious lasagna. Matilda was excited to show her mom what we had done, and I was looking forward to seeing Alice's reaction. When Alice walked in that evening, she looked exhausted. But when she saw the clean house and smelled the lasagna, her face lit up. "Wow, this is amazing. Thank you both so much," she said, hugging Matilda and then me. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But that night after Matilda had gone to bed, Alice and I sat down to talk. She told me how hard things had been at the hospital, how stressful her job was becoming. I wished there was more I could do to support her. Alice thanked me for understanding and promised to make more time for us as a family. I believed her, wanting to hold on to the hope that things would get better. One day Alice got an invitation to work for a few weeks at a hospital in Palm Beach. I was against it from the start. I didn't want her to leave home without me. Who would cook my breakfast and meet me in the evening with a delicious dinner? I was used to our routine, but Alice was determined. "It's only for 2 weeks," she said, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement. She really wanted to go, and eventually I gave in. 2 days later, Alice packed her bags and headed to Palm Beach. The house felt emptier without her. The mornings were quieter and dinners were less enjoyable without her company. Meanwhile, life in Orlando carried on. Every summer, a street food festival took place, offering various dishes and sweets. It was a big event, drawing families, singles, and plenty of young people. Matilda loved it, and I enjoyed seeing familiar faces and tasting new foods. This particular summer, some hooligans showed up at the festival. They were the type who liked to break things, steal, and mock the weaker folks. The atmosphere changed quickly. What was supposed to be a joyous event turned into chaos. These bandits ate, got drunk, shouted, and insulted everyone around them. Then they began smashing everything in sight. At first, the locals tried to handle it themselves, trying to calm the hooligans down. But their efforts only made things worse. The bandits grew angrier and more destructive. It wasn't until the siren of a police car echoed through the streets that the bandits finally decided to make a run for it. They jumped on their motorcycles and sped away, shouting wild cries as they disappeared. That day, Matilda and I didn't go to the festival. I had injured myself slightly while climbing down the ladder after repairing the roof of our house. We spent the day at home nursing my injury and missing out on the chaos that unfolded downtown. Alice called that evening to check in. She sounded happy, though a bit tired from her new job. I didn't tell her about the festival or the hooligans. There was no need to worry her. Instead, we talked about her work, Matilda's latest antics, and how much we missed her. 2 weeks felt like an eternity, but hearing Alice's voice made it a bit more bearable. It was summer, and with Matilda on vacation from school, I decided to send her to her grandparents' place. Something about Alice's tone on the phone had been bothering me. She seemed distant, distracted, and overly cheerful. I had to see for myself what was going on in Palm Beach. Driving a rented car to avoid being spotted, I arrived in Palm Beach and parked near the hospital where Alice was working. I waited, watching from a distance. It wasn't long before I saw her walk out of the hospital with an unfamiliar man. They were laughing and chatting, heading toward a nearby restaurant. This guy was limping on his left leg, by the way. I followed them, parking in the lot across the street. From my vantage point, I could see them through the restaurant's large windows. They were seated at a cozy corner table, and as I watched, the man reached over and started hugging Alice, then kissed her. She didn't resist. In fact, she leaned into it. My blood boiled. I got out of the car and headed towards the restaurant, my mind racing. At the entrance, a waitress asked if I had a reservation. I ignored her and pushed my way inside. I stormed up to their table and slammed my fist onto it with all my might. The plates and glasses rattled, and Alice looked up, her face pale with shock. "This is over, you bitch!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the bustling restaurant. The man tried to stand, but I grabbed his arm from behind, twisting it until he yelped in pain. I was ready to throw a punch when the waitress came up, saying she would call the police if I didn't let him go. "Do you have a reservation?" she repeated. "We have a lot of guests right now, so only by reservation." I released the man's arm and he slumped back into his seat. Turning to the waitress, I mumbled an apology. "In that case, I'm afraid you'll have to leave the establishment," she said firmly. "Or else what? You'll throw me out by force?" I retorted, my anger still simmering. I pointed to a table in the distance and said, "I think they're waiting for you over there." The waitress glanced back and ran off, giving me a moment to focus on Alice. The man was getting up to leave, groaning. I had half a mind to chase after him, but I stopped myself. This was between Alice and me now. I sat down across from her, the shock still evident on her face. "What the hell, Alice? Who is he?" She fumbled for words, her eyes wide. "Robert, it's not what it looks like." "Save it," I snapped. "I've seen enough. Damn you." Alice looked around, her eyes darting nervously. The restaurant's buzz of conversation seemed louder, and I noticed a few people glancing our way. I didn't care. This was my wife, my life, and it was crumbling right in front of me. "Robert, please, let's go somewhere private and talk," she pleaded, her voice shaky. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rage inside me. "Fine, let's go." We left the restaurant, Alice walking ahead of me. I could see the fear and confusion in her steps. We got into the car and drove in silence, heading back to her temporary apartment. We rode in silence, the tension thick in the air. Alice stared out the window while I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. She had to pay for the dish herself because this guy ran away. Her temporary apartment was a nondescript one-room place, the kind of place you rent when you don't plan to stay long. The walls were a dull beige and the furniture was basic. A bed, a small table, a couple of chairs, and a dresser. There was a small kitchenette in the corner and a tiny bathroom off to the side. It was impersonal, almost sterile. Alice sat on the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I took the chair across from her, still simmering with anger. "Don't hope that your stories will change my attitude towards you now, but try," I said coldly. She sighed deeply. "Robert, the day I arrived in Palm Beach, a man was brought into the hospital. He was a victim of a tiger shark attack. He was a surfer and he was lucky. The shark only grazed his leg, but he was covered in blood when he came in. The scars will stay with him forever." I listened, my jaw clenched. Alice saw a wounded man covered in blood. She felt sorry for him. Every day she looked after him as a nurse. But their relationship began to develop rapidly. She fell in love with him. A week later he was discharged. She came to his home. They met in a restaurant. Although he was out of the hospital, he was young and strong. He was only 32. His name was Johnny. He made her laugh and gave her flowers. I tried to push away the image of them together, but it was impossible. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. Flowers, great, just great. Alice's eyes welled up with tears. I know I betrayed you, but it wasn't planned, it just happened. I felt alive for the first time in years. Johnny made me feel special, wanted. Her words hit me like a hammer. This wasn't just a fling, she had fallen for this guy. I leaned back in the chair, struggling to process everything. Alice, you're telling me you fell in love with some guy in a week? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Robert, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just did. I looked at her, seeing the remorse in her eyes, but as I said, this story didn't change my attitude towards her. Well, I sat there for a while, the weight of Alice's words pressing down on me. The silence between us was suffocating. Eventually, I stood up, ready to leave. Alice looked up at me, her eyes pleading. And what now? She asked, her voice trembling. Without emotion, I replied, in any case, I don't believe in love at first sight. I thought I proved my love for you through all the best times we spent together. Since you did this, then go to hell. She started to say something, but I was already out the door. I got back in the car and drove away, my mind racing with anger and betrayal. The drive back to Orlando felt like an eternity. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, reflecting the void inside me. As I navigated the dark, empty road, I saw a commotion on the side of the highway. Several cars had pulled over, and people were gathered around looking frantic. I slowed down and pulled over to see what was going on. A young woman lay on the ground, her face pale and her breathing shallow. A man knelt beside her, pressing a jacket to a wound on her side. She's been stabbed, he said, his voice shaking. We need to get her to a hospital. Without hesitation, I jumped back into my car and drove closer. Get her in, I said. The man and another bystander carefully lifted her into the back seat, and I sped off toward the nearest hospital, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The woman moaned softly in the back seat, and I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. The man who had been helping her was now in the passenger seat, holding her hand and whispering words of reassurance. What happened? I asked, my mind momentarily distracted from my own problems. She was attacked in a rest area. I don't know who did it, it was chaos, he explained. Thank you for stopping. We reached the hospital and I rushed inside to get help. Nurses and doctors quickly took over, whisking the woman away on a stretcher. The man thanked me profusely, tears in his eyes. I nodded and turned to leave, my thoughts once again returning to Alice and the mess of my own life. As I drove the final stretch back to Orlando, my mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. Well, I'm doing good deeds like I just did. I'll have to clean the blood off the back seat, but why did they do this to me in return? I asked myself, thinking about Alice. Finally, I pulled into the driveway of our house. I arrived home around 1 a.m., exhausted and emotionally drained. I quickly washed up and went straight to bed, not even bothering to undress fully. I needed sleep more than anything, hoping it would give me some clarity by morning. When I woke up around 10 a.m., I checked my phone out of habit. Starting from 2 a.m. until 4 a.m., Alice had called me 8 times. I hadn't heard a single ring, even though I always kept my phone beside me. I shrugged it off, assuming she had cooked up some new story to convince me to stay with her. But I wasn't going to believe her. Mentally, I was already prepared to file for divorce. I got out of bed, determined to put the events of the previous night behind me. It was summer and there were very few contracts at the construction site. We had just completed our last job and there were no signs of new work coming in. With nothing holding me back, I decided to visit Matilda and her grandparents in Hinesville, Georgia. I figured a surprise visit would lift both our spirits. That same day, I went to the grocery store and bought some bread and sausage. I made a few sandwiches for the road, packed them up, and grabbed a bottle of water. The drive to Hinesville wasn't too long, but I wanted to be prepared. It had been a while since I visited my parents, and I missed them. Alice's parents had died in a car accident 4 years ago, a tragic event that had deeply affected her. But now, after everything, I didn't feel sorry for her at all. I locked up the house, threw my bag into the back seat of the car, and took one last look around before getting in. The trip to Hinesville went smoothly. The miles seemed to fly by as I drove through the sunny countryside, listening to the radio and trying to push thoughts of Alice out of my mind. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, The familiar sight of their cozy house brought a wave of comfort. Matilda was the first to spot me. She came running out of the house, her face lighting up with surprise and joy. "Dad!" she shouted, throwing her arms around me. I hugged her tightly, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. My parents followed her out, looking equally surprised but delighted. "Robert, what a pleasant surprise!" my mom exclaimed, pulling me into a hug. My dad clapped me on the back, grinning from ear to ear. We spent the day together, enjoying each other's company. Matilda showed me the drawings she had been working on, each one more creative than the last. She had inherited her grandmother's artistic talent, and it was clear she loved every minute of it. We played board games, laughed at old family stories, and even managed to squeeze in a visit to the local park where Matilda and I tossed a frisbee around. At dinner, my mom cooked up a feast, her way of celebrating my unexpected visit. We sat around the table, eating and talking, the conversation flowing easily. I hadn't told them about Alice yet. I wasn't ready to bring that dark cloud into this happy moment. They didn't ask too many questions, sensing perhaps that I needed this time to relax and recharge. After dinner, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Matilda was engrossed in a book while my parents and I sipped coffee and chatted. It felt good to be home, to be surrounded by people who loved and supported me unconditionally. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. It was strange, though, that Alice hadn't called again. She was supposed to stay at the hospital in Palm Beach for a couple more days. I figured she had either forgotten about me or was too ashamed and embarrassed to call. In any case, I wasn't going to be the one to reach out first. Let her deal with her guilt on her own. The next morning, we decided to take a trip to the beach. Matilda was thrilled, packing her bag with a swimsuit, towel, and sunscreen. We spent the day building sandcastles, splashing in the waves, and collecting seashells. My parents watched us from their beach chairs, smiling and taking pictures. As I watched Matilda run along the shoreline, her laughter mingling with the sound of the ocean, I felt a sense of clarity. By the time we got back to the house, we were all pleasantly exhausted. We had dinner, and then Matilda fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. I stayed up a bit longer, talking with my parents about the old days and trying to absorb the warmth and love that filled their home. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one last time. Still no calls from Alice. I sighed, a mix of relief and frustration. It didn't matter to me anymore. The next morning, I was sitting in the house talking to my father. My mother was in the kitchen, the familiar clinking of dishes and the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Matilda was playing on the porch, lost in her own little world. Suddenly, I heard an unfamiliar voice from outside. "Excuse me, does the McVeigh family live here?" Matilda fell silent, remembering what she had been taught about not talking to strangers. Without thinking twice, I stood up and walked to the porch. "Matilda, go inside," I said firmly. She nodded and hurried indoors. The man standing at the edge of the porch seemed vaguely familiar. As he saw me, he asked, "Robert McVeigh?" "Yes, it's me. What's the matter?" At first, his voice and face didn't register, but then it guessed that I had seen him somewhere before, or someone very similar to him. He seemed uneasy, almost hesitant. "I'm David Hartman," he introduced himself. "I'm Johnny's brother." My heart skipped a beat. Johnny, the man Alice had been seeing. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David looked around nervously. "Can we talk inside?" The mention of her name sent a chill down my spine. I nodded and led him into the house. We sat down in the living room, and I braced myself for whatever he was about to say. "Last night there was an incident," David began. "Johnny and Alice were together when it happened." "What happened?" I demanded. David took a deep breath. "Well, both of them were attacked. Someone broke into Johnny's place. He tried to fight them off, however got mortal injuries. He was stabbed. Alice called 911, but by the time they got there it was too late. He didn't make it." I felt a mix of shock and anger. "He passed?" "What about Alice?" I asked, my voice low. "She's in the hospital. She was hurt, but not as badly. She's been trying to reach you." "Shit!" I replied. "Do the police know who did it?" I asked, trying to piece everything together. David shook his head. "Not yet. They're investigating, but there's no clear suspect. Johnny had some illegal connections, people who might have had a reason to hurt him. I stood up, needing to move, to think. My father, who had been quietly listening, put a hand on my shoulder. "Son, anything I can help with?" "I need to see Alice," I said, the words coming out before I had fully thought them through. "At least make sure she's more or less okay." David nodded. "I can take you to the hospital. It's about a 6-hour drive from here." I turned to my father. "Dad, you and Mom stay with Matilda. I'll go alone." "Sure, good luck to you," he said as he went into the room where Matilda was playing. I grabbed my keys and followed David to his car. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent. When we arrived at the hospital, David led me to Alice's room. She was lying in bed looking pale and frail. Her eyes widened when she saw me, tears spilling over. "Robert," she whispered, her voice cracking. I stepped closer, taking in the sight of her, and decided to be blunt. "To be honest, Alice, while I was driving here and when I first found out what happened, I had a bit of sympathy for you. But now that I've seen you, it's gone." She started to cry, and I could see the fear and regret in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Robert. I never meant for any of this to happen." I stood there feeling nothing but a cold detachment. "You brought this on yourself, Alice." She looked away, her sobs filling the room. I didn't move, didn't try to comfort her. I couldn't. David, standing awkwardly by the door, cleared his throat. "I'll give you two some privacy." As he left, I sat down in the chair beside Alice's bed, keeping my distance. "Why didn't you call again?" I asked, my voice flat. "I was ashamed," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to say." I nodded, unsurprised. "Well, it's too late for apologies. I came here to see what happened, to get the truth and to see that you can take care of yourself. But don't expect me to forgive you." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Robert, please, Save it, Alice," I interrupted. "You made your bed, now lie in it." After these harsh words, a doctor walked into the room. I turned to him, eager to get some answers. "How is she doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. The doctor gave me a reassuring nod. "She received several blows, but only one of them was serious. We've already taken care of it. She's going to be fine." Realizing that Alice was out of danger, I felt a strange mix of relief and resignation. "Thank you for saving her life," I said to the doctor. Then, turning back to Alice, I added, "Goodbye." Without waiting for her response, I walked out of the room. David was waiting for me outside, his face etched with concern. "How did it go?" he asked. "Everything's fine," I replied. "No need to worry." David nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "So, I'll be handling my brother's funeral arrangements now." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, offering him a brief handshake. We exchanged a few more words of support, and then we parted ways. The sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. It was around 6 p.m. I got into my car and started the long drive back to Orlando. My mind was made up. Tomorrow I would file for divorce. Alice was supposed to work at the clinic tomorrow, but I knew she wouldn't be going anywhere for a while. About halfway through the drive, my phone rang. It was Alice. I answered, but didn't give her a chance to speak. "When you get better, come to Orlando. I'll tell you what will happen next." With that, I ended the call. I drove the rest of the way in silence, the road ahead clear. The next morning, I did what I had to do. I went to the courthouse and filed for divorce. The process was straightforward, with the paperwork reflecting the decisions I had already made in my mind. Alice found out about the divorce filing a couple of days later when she returned to Orlando. Her health had improved enough for her to leave the hospital, and she immediately headed back to face the inevitable. To her relief, there was some good news. The medical institution where she worked had decided to take her back. We divorced quietly and without scandal. There were no screaming matches, no drawn-out court battles. We both knew it was over, and dragging it out would only hurt Matilda more. When the final papers were signed, we said goodbye for the last time. Alice packed her things and moved to the city where she would continue her work in the hospital. Surprisingly, the divorce process wasn't very long. Perhaps it was because we both wanted to move on, to put the past behind us as quickly as possible. Matilda arrived back towards the end of the summer, just as everything was finalizing. She wasn't an adult, but she understood what was happening. She knew who was guilty and who was right, and she handled it with a maturity that made me proud. Matilda and I settled into our new routine. She was my priority, and I made sure she knew that. We spent more time together, focusing on building a stable and happy home for just the two of us. I wanted to make sure she felt secure, loved, and supported through all the changes. One unexpected positive outcome from all this was my growing friendship with David. After Johnny's death and the aftermath of the attack, David and I found common ground. We both had lost something significant, and it created a bond between us. We started meeting up regularly, talking about everything from the mundane to the deeply personal. David became a good friend, someone I could rely on. Our daughters even got along well, which made our friendship even stronger. Alice moved to her new city and threw herself into her work. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was doing well professionally. We didn't stay in touch except for matters concerning Matilda. My daughter adjusted to the new normal remarkably well. She thrived at school, made new friends, and continued to grow into an incredible young woman. We talked openly about the divorce, and I made sure she knew it was okay to have complicated feelings about it. Some weekends she would visit Alice, and other times she stayed with me. As the years went by, the pain of the past began to fade. Last week, we celebrated Matilda's 17th birthday. It was a small, joyful gathering with close friends and family. She's grown into a gorgeous young lady, and I'm so proud of her. Seeing her surrounded by people who love and support her, I realized how far we've come since those dark days. During the celebration, I found out that Alice has a boyfriend. They've been dating for several months. It's strange to think of her moving on, but it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I guess I've made my peace with the past. As for me, I haven't had anyone in my life since the divorce. I'm not sure if I ever will. I don't know if there is love after 40. What do you think?